Well, the weather's getting warmer, so it's time for a layout update, which means I have to talk to the camera, which I don't really like to do. We'll see how long I can go before the furnace kicks in. So with spring, I usually kind of wrap things up and then resume work in the fall. So let's see what I've accomplished since the last time. Just to refresh memory, the layout at one time at least was a double track figure 8, and this bridge marks where the two tracks crossed over. So we have the main lines here, and I often refer to them as the blue line and the orange line because they are separate power districts. One of them is blue and one's orange. It's just how I wired them up using electrical tape to indicate the colors. One thing we'll notice over here is this used to be a tunnel. It came down and connected up to the orange line, and it now has a new connection, and we'll see where that goes. And I have some interesting plans for this, assuming I can make it work, so hopefully this will be something really interesting in the future. Previously, this line came out of a tunnel, came down here, and connected up here. Here's the foam. Here's where I cut these lines, these 3 lines, and I cut away the foam along this area. And I replaced it with plywood. This layout's really the first layout I ever built. And so when I started, I used foam, but then I realized I didn't like foam. So in this case, I cut away the foam and I replaced it with 1/4-inch plywood, and then realized I didn't like 1/4-inch plywood. It's not really stable enough. So later on, I was using 1/2-inch. So I don't know whether I need to come back and replace this with 1/2-inch plywood, or even better, 3/4-inch plywood. It's really stable, but it's a little bit wavy. I wish it was a little flatter for the about an 8-foot run of this plywood. So we're coming over here, and there will be some buildings here. I am not entirely sure what yet. Here we have a transition where we go from cork on to plywood, so the track is directly on the plywood. And I think that this piece of plywood is going to have to be replaced, because to try and save money, I used plywood that had paint on it, and there was enough layers of paint that it's actually a little bit thicker than the rest of the unpainted plywood. So that's something to be aware of. Here on the mainline tracks, this is where the old crossovers used to be. I had 2 crossovers, and they were actually some of the first track that I ever laid, and they really didn't work very well, and they're one of the main reasons, besides the foam reason, why I decided to rip this up and redo it. And actually yet another reason was this track came down much closer. It really was too close, and I couldn't get some of the buildings in here that I wanted to get in. So moving this track away from the 2 main lines is one of the reasons I did the realignment. And then also these main lines now kind of hang over the edge a little tiny bit. So I've extended out about 1.5 inches or 2 inches to give a little more room to lay the track. Coming down further, this is where Swackhammer's welding is going to go. Here you can see where I went from foam onto plywood again. So I cut out the foam right along this area and extended plywood up to this area. And kind of the trick, I guess, to getting foam removed and attaching wood to the foam area is when you cut, you want to try and cut up so that some rail extends over the edge here. And so you're cutting up from underneath the rail, so you can have some rails extend, and then you have something to attach it to and kind of a reference point to level everything out. So it's a little bit difficult, but it's not really all that hard, so I didn't really have too much difficulty getting these to align. And in this case, it's just a matter of getting the right height support underneath. I think I kind of got lucky because the plywood thickness plus the cork was just enough to come up to where it needed to be. So for this line, I had to cut away part of this hill, and then I built a retaining wall to go in, fit there. Here's some more space for buildings. I'm not entirely sure yet what these buildings are going to be. Here I transitioned from the 1/4-inch plywood onto the 1/2-inch plywood. The 1/4-inch plywood, there's a board that runs lengthwise along the plywood that gives it some support, but there's still some undulations here on this bit of track. And when you run like long freight cars, you can really kind of see them move. So I'm not really happy about that. Might do something about it. So now we get to Wilford Bramble Company. So this was a previous video, obviously. So the one track connects here, runs across the trestle. Then we have the rear track with the retaining wall, and then the two main lines cross the bridges here. So I think I need to redo the levels here for the bridges, bring it up more to the base of the Wilford Bramble Company, and probably rebuild the bridge piers and the abutments. That's not really that difficult, so I'll just take care of that at some point. Here is the Bar Mills Old Dominion Broom Company, I believe it is, and I think I'm probably going to put it there. Coming down a little further, this is one of the buildings from Hooligan's Alley. I think it looks pretty good here, although I'm not entirely sure I want to split up Hooligan's Alley yet, but we'll see what I do. It's not actually attached yet. So I did some scenery around here, did some ballasting on the new track. All this track is new. Here we get to the Carter Supply Building from Foscale Models. That, of course, is another video. And the Central Valley Bridge, which, of course, is a video. This bridge still has some track problems. Trains running in this way are hitting these guide rails sometimes and screeching to a halt. And I think that that's a problem partly because this track is not glued down onto the base yet. Once I glue that down, it'll fix it. And I also need to do a little bit of a height adjustment over here to fix those. Here on this side, you can see I have a tongue depressor in here, so I need to bring up the bridge a little tiny bit to make everything work on this end. One of the problems with the bridge is that I put the track in the wrong spot. One of these tracks is in the wrong spot. It's slightly off from where it's supposed to be. So I need to fix that. And then that is going to make me have to change the approach track for the bridge. Here's a picture from early on in the build after I ripped out a lot of the old parts of the layout, and you can kind of see the gaps that are missing. And I've started adding in the plywood and laying some of the track. You have the two main lines coming down on the right side and the gap where the bridge is going to be. And then some of the other track is realigned. And then the white piece of foam board is the size of the Central Valley Bridge. So I was kind of planning out to put that bridge in there. This is before I had built the bridge. But this will give you an idea of what it looked like under construction. Turning around from where I was standing, I have built this shelf area, and this was going to be a staging yard, and this was built mostly from the track that I removed from the track I had ripped off when I redid the layout. The original plan was this was going to be a 4-track staging yard with some background buildings. But then I got an idea that I wanted to make this a 2-level staging area. So the first level that you see here is going to be like subterranean, kind of like a subway. And in order to make that work, I think I need to remove the 4 tracks and probably just use 3 tracks, and they probably need to be spaced farther apart. So I got to kind of re-engineer any of this anyway. And then I'm going to build another level on top of that. So this level will be visible kind of as a shadow box kind of thing. And then the top level will have the staging yard and the background buildings. Here's a switch panel for the 4 tracks. Each of the 4 tracks can be powered on and off separately so that when you power up your system, any locomotives sitting there don't just start making noise. Here we get to 2 duck unders that feed the staging yard. And I made these removable, or at least semi-removable. So you just take out some screws, and I used quick connectors, disconnect the connectors, and there's disconnectors on the other end, and then just lift this out. So there is the other end where you just take out the screws and disconnect, and then you can remove this to get in and out. And here's the other end of the staging yard. So the staging yard has run-through capability. So this comes up, and there's another duck under that is also removable, and then that takes it back up to the main lines. So as I said, this was at one time a figure 8, kind of a deformed double track figure 8. It no longer is a double track figure 8 because now the 2 main lines cross back over each other here. So the 2 main lines are here, and then these 2 are the 2 main lines. So now it's more of what you might call a braided double track. And that had some ramifications. on reversing loops. So originally there were 5 reversing loops on this layout, and then after I kind of redid it, I realized that there were 0 reversing loops on the layout. So I went from 5 to 0, and I thought, well, that would be nice. I don't need to make use of the reversing circuits. But actually, some of the track that was on the loop is now still reversed polarity, so I still have to use the reversing circuits. Some of it I might rewire, but since everything works right now, I'm not sure what the point of that would be necessarily. So now both of those tracks come out and they go up around in a loop and then come back. And one of the really nice things about that is that the gradient is softer. The previous loop that came back around had a fairly stiff gradient, and it was kind of difficult for some of the locomotives with a full train to get up the hill. The previous layout actually didn't have enough room for all of the buildings that I had built. So one of the main reasons that I redid this is now I have a lot more room to add buildings. This is the track that comes off the main lines, and then this turnout takes it over to the lower level of the staging yard across the duck under, the removable duck under. This section of the turnout is going to take it back around to the track that curves away from behind the Carter Supply building from Foscale Models. And then this turnout is going to take it to the upper level of the staging yard. So it is just barely going to clear the lower level right here. It's going to come across, and there's just enough clearance to get a train underneath, assuming it's not like double stacks. So all of this section here, I think, has some really interesting scenery potential to make something really cool with retaining walls and maybe a little bridge or something, who knows what, in here to make that work. One thing about the turnouts, I was mostly using Atlas turnouts. And the reason is when I started building this, I really didn't know that there was options other than Atlas because I really hadn't been into trains since the 70s. So I used Atlas turnouts here, and I really don't like them. So I'm kind of making my way over to Pico. So like this one's a Pico, the snap switch. And in this case, I remembered to put in the hole so I can motorize this particular switch. A lot of the other ones I never really thought about putting in the hole to run the motor wire up through the bottom. And there are some where I can't do it anyway because there's supports that are blocking it. But I think I'm going to start heading in the direction of using Picos. I don't know yet whether I'm going to replace some of these with Picos because, you know, switches are a little expensive. I have a pretty healthy budget, but I'm not ridiculous about it. So we'll see what happens here. I also am kind of playing around with microengineering track versus Atlas track and kind of coming around to microengineering, but Atlas still has some advantages, so it's a little bit of a mix at this point. A little bit of an overview. You know, when you go and you take your existing train and just rip everything up and you're trying to cut the pieces of plywood to fit together here, there's a lot of like, what in the world am I doing moments. But I think I did a pretty good job of getting everything together without really having a plan. I kind of knew, you know, the general plan. I was going to make a loop. But in terms of actually doing, you know, measurements and dimensions, that kind of stuff, there wasn't a whole lot. It was kind of like eyeballing, and then I was paying attention to the gradient and the curves, making sure the curves weren't too tight, and making sure the gradient was not too steep. So that was the main concern. And then this is all 1/2-inch plywood going through here, and then it's all on cork. Here we have a turnout that goes nowhere. Just runs off to the side. Since I didn't really have much of a plan and I don't really know what buildings I'm going to build in the future, I just threw some turnouts in, assuming that at some point there's going to be a building somewhere that it will run to. So this is one of those that does that. This was originally one of those that did that, but then when I came up with my double deck staging yard idea, I figured out that I could run this over to the upper deck of the staging yard. I'm not entirely sure what the timing was of when I figured out the staging yard concept, the double deck staging yard concept, and when I put this in. Here in the darkness is the turnout. This is a Pico turnout that takes us off the main line on the track, that runs around, and then over to the lower level, or what will be the lower level of the staging yard. So as I said, one of the main reasons that I ripped up the track, the old track, was because the crossovers that went from one main line to the other did not work reliably. So I decided I was going to put in very reliable crossovers. And to do that, I spaced the track apart farther. So one of my track design rules that I kind of figured out is that a locomotive or a freight car or whatever should never be turning left or right at the same time. So when you're going across your crossovers, you should straighten out before you get to the other crossover. So this is my longest running thing, engine, locomotive, freight car or whatever. And you can see that it fits entirely on the straight section of track before coming across over to the other crossover and getting on the other track. So that was one of the ideas here, to keep this reliable so that your cars are, the train is really straightening out before it comes back on the other main line. I think that also gives a little more interesting scenery options here. So we'll see what I can do with that. But that was one of the goals here. Again, these are Atlas turnouts, and I'm thinking about replacing them. So the third track comes down here, and then we have a split off for some building that will eventually be there. And then it continues on, and it goes through what was originally the swamp area, and then back up and attaches back to the existing track that was there previously. If we look at this section, this bridge was there, but it was a single bridge, so it came over to this part. So I cut away everything here. You can see kind of the cut line, and I put in a piece of plywood here, and then I extended this bridge out a little bit for not really any reason other than to make it look better, I guess. There wasn't really any design feature. I think I had the bridge and decided to put it to use. So rebuild an abutment, and then rebuilt these supports to go off. And then this was what was going to be kind of a swamp area. This was a hill that kind of came over. And then all that goes back to track that was already there.
Here's that same area from the other side early in the construction phase.
This is another section that received a lot of work. This turnout was there previously, but it just went nowhere. And then this was just like a kind of a big hole. So I just basically scratch built some bridges that I thought looked interesting, nothing necessarily realistic about them. And I poured some water in this little depression area, and then these come across. And this bridge is going to go off to Baxter's Building Supply. And this is going to go just to some other buildings. I'm not entirely sure what yet. So it just goes over to empty plywood at this point.
This was a little bit of a tricky section. So it started out by building out the shape in foam, and then here I've covered it with plaster cloth and some Sculptamold. After adding scenery to the culvert area, I had to start building out to the left of it. And I started by just kind of building the track base with some strips of plywood. Now we're getting a little farther along. So I've built out to the left with some sheet plywood and filled in some of the gaps with plaster cloth and Sculptamold. Then finally some crude painting to kind of see where I am with the scenery. There are some retaining walls that are made just out of craft plywood, and I built in the bridge abutments, and I was trying to keep some space open so I could crawl in under there and do work. And you can see a piece of that Central Valley Bridge in the background.
Here we can see the other end of the layout. So we have the two tracks coming off. The one track is going to come up to Baxter's Building Supply. This is my template that's the same size as the diorama. The other track is going to come over here where there will be some buildings and a lot more space for buildings here. Here we have the viaduct coming up. And I have finally attached some buildings permanently onto the layout. So we have the Cundy Hotel and Wicked Wanda's. Both of those were a previous build. And then of course I scenery up the mountain. Here's the graffiti wall trench, which goes into the tunnel. And then the other side of the tunnel comes out on the duck under that goes to the staging yard. So here's the back side of the buildings. We have Wicked Wanda's, little retaining wall, little road comes down that goes up to Wicked Wanda's in the hotel. There'll be a crossing here and it'll come back across. There's just some junk piles that are sitting there temporarily. And over here we have Muldoon's Distillery. So as difficult as Muldoon's Distillery was to build, it was also pretty difficult to get installed into the layout. So what I did was I built really a diorama base that had the track section, and it was such that the building could be added or removed, just placed on top of the diorama base or removed. So the elevation change was done with foam. Then I put the diorama base into the layout, and then once I got it in pretty well, then I added the building in on top and sealed the building around it.
In this picture, I have installed the diorama base. You can see that with the little track section and the grass. And I've installed the plywood and the cork for the track running up to it. What the clamps are doing is holding on a piece of sort of rigid cardboard that was packing material that I was going to use to support the base of the scenery. But I ended up ripping that out because it just didn't really work right. It kind of took about 2 attempts to build out this section. So the first attempt was sort of ripped out and then I started over. This is still kind of a planning phase. I have a couple mock-up retaining walls in the background, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to fit the culvert and the buildings and everything into this little scene. It actually was a tighter fit than I was expecting. And here I removed a lot of that cardboard and I've started to put in the plaster cloth, and I'm down to sort of the one retaining wall, the short retaining wall in the background, which is just a piece of strip craft plywood.
Here, this piece of wood was the base of the diorama, and this foam was the diorama, and then it kind of ended here. So this is the main part of the actual layout. So that was the cutover. So that was the piece I inserted in. Here's Cundy Hotel, and it's supposed to look a little abandoned and overgrown, which worked out well because there were some gaps. One of the reasons this mountain kind of came up so high was they kept trying to flatten out the top, and I finally just gave up. There was kind of just enough space at the top to get these buildings in. So in order to cover the gaps, I put in this vegetation, and I was kind of going to do that anyway, but it just worked out really well. Here is the backside of this little area. By the way, this open hole is where the G. Willikers Machinery Wholesale building is going to go whenever I get that done. But I got to be able to leave this hole open as long as possible so I can get in and do stuff in here before I attach that. But that'll be the last thing that goes in this section. So the only thing remaining for Muldoon's Distillery is putting in the water wheel, which for some reason I'm just taking my time on, and this little structure is not fixed in yet. And then we'll fill up this area with some water. I already tested it for leaks and it looks pretty good. And then there's a chimney needs to go in here. So coming from Muldoon's and this little scenery area, the tunnel goes under there, then it comes out here, goes over to the duck under, and then off to the staging yard, lower level. As I said, the lower level of the staging yard is run through, so it's going to be at least 2 tracks run through, maybe all 3 tracks will be run through. But the upper level is not going to be a run through, it's just going to be dead end, so it only the upper level is only accessible from the other end of the staging yard. This little section of track is another one that has a switch. Right here there's a little on-off switch so that you can have locomotives sitting on the track, and then when you power up your system, if this is off, the sound won't come on. So I think that's a good idea to try and put in on sidings and stuff if it's a option for you. So again, back here where we cut off to the foam, cut up to the foam and put in the plywood, and then use risers to bring it up to the correct height. And this is actually pretty reliable. This is certainly not the worst track joint on the layout. So even though it was a lot of work, I think it really paid off. I have a lot better track. I got rid of some foam, and I got a much longer amount of track and some areas to put in some new buildings, and of course some new bridges. So pretty happy with the work that I did so far.